It was almost midnight, and Caroline still had not returned. She decalled a couple of hours ago, saying she was late for work because of some urgent report. Normally, Robert did not doubt her word, but today was different. Something in her voice sounded strained. Robert had begun to notice an oddity in his wife lately. Caroline had always been punctual and precise with her plans, but for the past 2 weeks her schedule had become erratic. She often said she was traveling to meetings with colleagues or staying late at the office, but returned home with a tired, almost guilty look on her face. Their home always seemed to be cozy and orderly. She and Caroline were raising 2 children, a 7-year-old son, James, and a 12-year-old daughter, Sophia. Even on the busiest days of work or family hustle and bustle, Caroline found time to have dinner with her family or talk to the children before bedtime. But now she was hardly ever home, and the children were starting to ask questions. Sophia once asked why Mom was so often late, and James, who did not understand the situation yet, just waited by the window until he fell asleep on the couch. It was past midnight on the clock, and Robert, in order not to fall asleep while waiting for his wife, decided to do the family finances while he waited for her return. He sat down at the kitchen table, opened his laptop, and started checking the accounts. Everything looked familiar, spending on groceries, clothes, and small household necessities. But one item caught his attention. It was the restaurant La Fontaine, the same one where they had long planned to go together but never got together. The amount was impressive, over $300. Robert frowned. He remembered Caroline telling him a few weeks ago that it was hard to get reservations at the restaurant now, especially on weekends. But why was she there without him? Was it a business meeting? Dinner with friends? Or was it something else? Thoughts swirled in his head. He decided not to jump to conclusions. Maybe it's just a bill for a company lunch or a client meeting, he thought, trying to calm himself down. Late that night, when Caroline finally came home, Robert was already sitting in the living room with a cup of coffee. Her footsteps sounded too quiet in the hallway, as if she was trying to slip inside unnoticed. "How was your day?" Robert said, carefully controlling his tone so that no tension slipped into his voice and watching her carefully as she filled the glass with water. "The usual," she replied with a slight shrug, avoiding his gaze and taking a sip. "Nothing remarkable." Robert sensed she was avoiding meeting his gaze. It made him uncomfortable, but he decided not to press. Instead, he stood up and walked over to her coat to hang in the closet. As he picked it up, something fell out of the pocket and onto the floor. It was a check folded in half. Robert picked it up and took a quick glance. It was the same restaurant, La Fontaine. His gaze fell on the date. The evening he'd been home with the kids, and Caroline had said she was working late. "What's this?" he asked, holding the receipt in front of her. Caroline froze for a moment, then smiled quickly, but the smile looked too strained. "Oh, this must have stayed after lunch with my coworkers. We were meeting with a client, and I just forgot to throw it out." Robert nodded, but details were already starting to form in his head. If it was a coworker lunch, why not she mention it earlier? And why did she look like she'd been caught in the act? The next morning, waking up earlier than usual, he decided to check Caroline's coat while she was in the shower. Nothing. The pockets were empty. But in the bathroom, he heard her cell phone vibrate briefly on the sink. Robert approached, but Caroline, as if sensing his presence, immediately turned off the water and came out with a towel. "Is everything all right?" she asked, glancing quickly at the phone. "Of course," he replied, stepping back and stepping out of the tub. Caroline left for work and Robert stayed home. He sat at the kitchen table, looking at the check he could not get out of his mind. It seemed to him that this little piece of paper held the key to some important truth, but he did not know what to do with it. It would have to be decided later. For now, he decided to watch and wait. Saturday night stretched slowly. Robert sat on the couch, mindlessly changing the TV channels. The children were already asleep. Sophia had covered herself with a blanket in her room, and James, cuddling his favorite toy, had long ago fallen into the world of dreams. Caroline said she'd be late for another business meeting. Robert's insides were seething with anxiety. He'd been feeling on edge for days now. The check from the restaurant, the strain in his wife's voice, her sudden detachment. It was all adding up to something unsettling. Suddenly, he remembered that a coworker had mentioned the popular Aurora Club that Caroline had mentioned last week in a conversation about client meetings. Almost automatically, he decided to drive down there himself just to check it out. He did not know what he was looking for, but he could not stay home any longer. Half an hour later, Robert pulled up in front of the club. The bright neon lights reflected on the wet pavement, and there was a line of people waiting to get in. Robert felt a little out of place. He had not been to a place like this in years. But today he was not just a guest. He was an observer. Walking inside, he felt the noisy atmosphere surround him. Loud music, light flashes, and crowds of people dancing and laughing created a chaotic kaleidoscope. Robert moved toward the bar. He sat down on a high stool, ordered a mineral water, and began to scrutinize the space. After a few minutes, he spotted a familiar silhouette. Caroline. She was standing at the far end of the room, next to a tall man dressed in a decidedly unclub-like manner. Dark suit, white shirt, confident posture. Robert recognized him instantly. It was Evan Harris, the famous soccer player whose face had recently appeared on the covers of magazines. Robert had heard his name from neighborhood kids who were into sports. Caroline laughed, her hand barely touching Evan's shoulder, and her gaze, too warm, was directed right at him. Robert felt everything go cold inside. There was no doubt about it. This was not a work dinner or a client meeting. This was something more. He was about to approach when he noticed another figure nearby. It was his wife's friend Maggie. She stood slightly behind, clearly trying not to stand out, but her gaze followed Robert. As soon as their eyes met, her face changed. She quickly averted her gaze and pretended to look for someone in the crowd. Robert took a decisive step toward Caroline, but suddenly his path was blocked by a massive security guard who crossed his arms over his chest with an air of defiant impregnability. "I'm sorry, sir. This area is restricted," he said with an underlining politeness behind which there was a distinct hardness. "That's my wife," Robert objected sharply, his voice filled with controlled anger as he pointed toward Caroline. The guard raised an eyebrow, studying him with a dose of skepticism, but his stance remained unchanged. "I apologize, sir," he said, remaining steadfast. "However, our rules preclude you from entering this area. I strongly advise you to return to the common room." Robert felt his heart racing. He turned and noticed that Maggie had now moved closer to Caroline, as if trying to shield her from Robert's gaze. The gesture only made him more certain that something was being kept from him here. He stepped aside, but he was not about to give up. Robert knew he had to be careful in situations like this. He pulled out his cell phone and took a few pictures, trying to capture what was happening. His hands were shaking slightly, but he kept taking pictures until Caroline and Evan started moving toward the exit. Maggie followed behind them, occasionally looking back. Robert knew that if he missed them now, he might not find out anything more. He headed off following, trying to keep his distance. Caroline and Evan went out the back exit where the black car was parked. Robert saw Maggie look back one more time before getting into it next. He stayed in the shadows, watching the car pull away. Her taillights slowly disappeared around the corner, but Robert was not about to stop. He took quick steps back to his car, trying to keep the storm of emotions under control. With trembling hands, he dialed the number of a friend who worked as a private investigator. "Mike, sorry for the late call, but I need your help," he said, trying to speak calmly, though his voice trembled. "What's wrong?" Mike asked, instantly switching to a businesslike tone. Robert briefly described the situation without going into emotional details and asked Mike to find out where the car with Caroline might have stopped. Mike promised to begin the search immediately. While Robert sat in the car waiting for a response, he opened the gallery on his phone and began looking through the photos he had taken. One of the pictures clearly showed Caroline looking at Evan with an expression that Robert could not interpret as anything other than admiration. His fingers gripped the phone tightly, but he forced himself to breathe deeply so he would not panic. A few minutes later, the phone rang. It was Mike. "I got something. The car is registered to a rental taken through one of the big companies. Looks like they re-headed to a hotel on the outskirts of town. You sure this is what you're re-looking for?" Mike's voice sounded subdued. Robert closed his eyes for a moment, weighing what he heard. He knew that the night ahead could change his life forever. Images from days gone by surfaced in his mind. Caroline's warm laughter, trips together with the children, family dinners that seemed so sincere. And now all of that was probably in jeopardy. But he also realized that without definitive answers, he could not move forward. "Yeah, Mike. Thanks for your help. I'll go get them," he replied, starting the engine. He turned on the headlights and drove slowly onto the empty street, trying to focus on the road. The lights of the club were left behind, immersed in the rhythmic noise of the music, which now seemed distant and meaningless. Robert could feel the tension building, as if a spring was tightening inside him more and more with each kilometer. The phone vibrated with a new message. It was Mike, the Westbridge Inn. "They moved in there a few minutes ago. I'm nearby. Call me if you need anything." Robert glimpsed the message, then returned his gaze to the road. He knew he was approaching a place where things could get clearer or, conversely, more complicated. Pulling up to the hotel, he parked the car a short distance from the entrance. A familiar silhouette could be seen in the distance. Mike was standing by his car, pretending to talk on the phone, but watching the entrance carefully. Robert approached him, trying not to attract attention. "Are they in a room?" he asked quietly. "Most likely. They came through the lobby quickly, and they already had the key." Mike looked at Robert, frowning slightly. "Are you sure you won't go that far?" Robert hesitated for a moment. He did not know if he was ready to see his worst fears confirmed, but he knew he could not stop. He nodded. "Would you be able to find out what number?" Mike nodded quickly, pulling out his tablet. After a couple minutes, he whispered, "Number 402, 4th floor, into the hallway. Do you want to go inside, or will you wait?" Robert pondered the option. Go in now, wait, and gather more information? The thoughts in his head were chaotic. He turned around, looking at the inn, lit by a soft golden light. A light silhouette flashed in the distance, but too quickly for him to see anything. "I have to make sure," he replied, taking a deep breath. "Mike, stay here. If anything happens, I'll call you." He headed for the entrance, trying to look confident. As he rode up the elevator, he felt the air around him grow denser. On the 4th floor, the hallway was quiet. Robert stopped in front of the door with the number 402, freezing for a moment. Muffled voices echoed inside, their tone indicating a tense but unspoken dialogue. Robert slowly put his hand to the door, trying to catch any details. Muffled intonations occasionally broke through the wood, but the words remained indistinguishable. He took a step back and looked at the number, making sure he was indeed at the right door, then approached again. His palms grew damp, and his heart pounded in time with the rising anxiety. He put his ear closer, but instead of clear words, he heard only muffled laughter, short, as if held back. It made him tense up even more. The sense of the unknown mixed with the rage that came with it. He raised his hand to knock, but stopped at the last moment. The sound of footsteps at the end of the hallway made him recoil from the door. Robert turned around and saw a maid carrying a cart of towels. She gave him a brief nod, as if not noticing his anxious state, and continued on her way. Robert pretended to check his phone, trying to look indifferent, but each step the maid took seemed louder than the last. When she disappeared around the corner, he turned to the door again. Something rattled inside, a sound like furniture moving or something heavy falling. It made him take a step back, looking tensely at the door. The noise died down, but the voices grew louder, as if an argument had broken out in the room. Robert stood there, his breathing becoming ragged. He could not decide whether to stay here and wait for events to unfold on their own, or to act. Every second of waiting felt like an hour. He wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans and closed his eyes for a moment, trying to collect himself. Images of the past flashed through his mind, their family dinners, the smiles of their children, the moments when life had seemed simple and happy. Suddenly, a force awoke inside him that spurred him into action. Robert raised his hand and knocked gently. There was no answer. There was silence inside, so sudden and complete that it only heightened his suspicions. He knocked again, a little louder, and stood still, waiting for some movement. A few seconds later, the door opened slightly, and Maggie, his wife's friend, appeared in the gap. Her eyes widened, and her face froze in a mixture of surprise and obvious worry. "Robert, what are you doing here?" she whispered, instantly pulling the door shut as if trying to keep him outside. But Robert was not going to stop. He gave the door a sharp push, and it swung open, forcing Maggie backward. The camera on his phone was already recording what was happening. Inside, the room looked like a scene from a movie. Champagne and glasses were on the table. The chair had been carelessly pushed back, and the faint scent of expensive perfume wafted through the air. Maggie was in a light silk robe, her hair slightly disheveled. She looked confused, but did not have time to say anything before the sound of the door opening came from the bathroom. Robert turned, and his heart nearly jumped out of his chest. Caroline stepped out of the shower wrapped in a white towel. Her hair was disheveled, and a look of horror froze on her face when she saw Robert. "What the? Robert?" She took a step back, pressing the towel closer to her body. Sitting on the bed, leaning carelessly on the pillows, was Evan Harris. He was shirtless, his relaxed posture a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere in the room. He looked up at Robert slowly, as if assessing the situation. "This is too much," Robert said quietly, his voice full of controlled anger as the camera continued to roll. "I think I need to save all of this for the memories." Maggie seemed to want to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. Caroline froze, as if she could not find the words to explain the situation. Evan, on the other hand, only grinned, leaning back. "Look, buddy, it's not what it looks like," he began, but Robert interrupted him with a sharp motion of his hand. "Not what it looks like. You re-sitting here in a room with two women, and my wife comes out of the shower wrapped in a short towel. Do you really think I have any doubts left?" Robert's voice was full of cold fury. His hand with the phone remained motionless, recording every second. Caroline finally took a step forward, holding out her hand as if she wanted to stop him. "Robert, please, let us talk about this." Her voice shook, but that only made him angrier. "Talk? Now? After I see you with these people, in this situation?" His voice was louder, each word sounding like a blow. "I have nothing to discuss. You said it all with your actions, and I wrote it all down, so I'll never question it again." He took a step back, turned, and walked out of the room, leaving the door open. Maggie tried to catch up with him, but Robert moved quickly toward the elevator. His face was frozen with a mixture of anger and pain. Robert walked into the house, trying not to wake the kids, and holding back the wave of rage that was tearing him up from the inside out. The phone screen lit up with pictures and videos from the hotel room. It was clear Caroline had betrayed him, but now he was not going to just let it go. He knew that inaction would make him weak in everyone's eyes, and especially his own. His niece Brooke, always interested in technology and social media, was the one he decided to trust with the next step. She was only 23, but her skills with digital platforms could easily rival the professionals. Robert contacted her that same night. "Hey, Brooke, it's Robert. I need your help. It's urgent." His voice was harsh but confident. Brooke reacted instantly. "Of course, Uncle. What's wrong?" Robert did not go into details over the phone. Instead, he asked her to come over the next day. When she arrived, he showed her the pictures and videos taken at the hotel. Brooke stared at the screen for a long time without saying a word, then slowly looked up at him. This is real?" Her voice sounded indignant. "It is real," Robert replied dryly, "and I want everyone to know about it." Brooke was quiet for a moment, assessing the situation. "Okay, I have an idea, but it's going to take time and maybe a little help," she grinned. "I have a friend, Josh. He is a hacker. In a good way. If you want to hit them, we need his help." Robert nodded without asking too many questions. A couple hours later, Brooke brought in Josh, a young man with a scruffy beard and a laptop that looked like his second skin. After a brief discussion of the plan, Josh got down to business. The first step was to hack into Caroline and that soccer player Evan's social media accounts. Josh sat at his desk, typing intently while Brooke explained to Robert what they were going to do. "We're going to create a snowball effect. We publish compromising material, add text that will make them look worse. Then we tap into a network of fake accounts to spread it across platforms. It'll be like a spontaneous explosion. Robert listened, clenching his fists tensely. He knew it was a risky move, but at this point he did not care. He wanted justice, even if it turned out to be brutal. After a few hours of work, Josh exhaled. It's done. We are now masters of their accounts. Tell us what to write. Robert thought for a moment, then began to dictate. Write that Caroline admits her affair with Evan. Make it sound like she's proud of it. Something like, I could not pass up the chance to be with a successful man like Evan Harris. That would emphasize her selfishness. Brooke nodded and added, you could also insert that she thinks it's just a fun mistake that everyone should realize. That would piss off her friends and coworkers. Josh quickly typed the text and clicked publish. The post instantly appeared on Caroline's page. They then did the same with Evan's account, adding a photo from the room with the caption, sometimes success requires sacrifice, to be exact. Less than an hour later, the posting started gaining momentum. Comments flowed from indignation to gloating. Some accused Caroline of hypocrisy. Others asked Evan how he was going to save his reputation. Brooke was actively following the dynamic, adding screenshots and posting on popular forums and Facebook pages. People have already started reposting. It's all going according to plan, she remarked. But Robert was not about to stop. He asked Josh to dig up more information about Evan. A couple hours later, he found photos and documents that pointed to his involvement in other scandals. This is the bomb, Josh said, showing Robert an image where Evan was seen with another married woman. We can make it known to everyone. Robert grinned, but his gaze remained cold. Publish it. Let this be the beginning of the end for him. Over the next day, the news spread across the internet. Popular blogs, sports sites, and even news outlets began writing about the scandal. Robert sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen, where each new headline was like an affirmation of his victory. Soccer star embroiled in love triangle. Family drama exposed online. Evan Harris, field hero or marriage destroyer? Carolina's phone rang nonstop, but she did not answer. Her coworkers tried to contact her to discuss the fallout from the scandal, but every message and call went unanswered. Evan reportedly canceled a training session to deal with the situation and find a way to minimize the damage. However, reporters were already guarding him outside his home, asking uncomfortable questions. Robert sat in his office, watching the chaos unfold. His phone vibrated with constant notifications, messages from friends, discussions on social networks, comments on publications. He realized the process was underway, but a sense of satisfaction mixed with deep pain and frustration. At that moment, Brooke walked into the office, her face tense. Robert, I just found out that Evan's lawyers have started preparing a statement. They want to accuse us of defamation and countersue us. Robert frowned, but his voice remained calm. We have enough evidence. Let them try. If they want a war, they'll get one. I think so too, Brooke agreed, but there was anxiety in her gaze. We have to be ready for anything. Evan has vast resources, and they'll try to regain control of the situation. Robert nodded, his thoughts already drifting to the next step. This was only the beginning of the battle, and he was ready for a long war. Suddenly, Caroline flew into the house like a storm. Her face was twisted with anger, and her voice thundered, shattering the silence of the family evening. You have destroyed my life, she screamed, looking directly at Robert, who stood in the living room with an impenetrable expression. What have you done? Sophia and James, who had previously been playing a board game in the next room, froze. Hearing their mother's screams, they looked at each other, and without saying anything, they quietly went upstairs, hiding in their room. The door closed behind them, muffling any further sounds of scandal. Destroyed your life? Robert repeated slowly, his voice cold and quiet, but with a sense of menace in it. What do you think you did to our family? Caroline threw her bag onto the couch, waving her hands in despair. It was just one time, Robert. You had no right to humiliate me like that. These publications, this trial, it is all too much. Now no one wants to do business with me. My coworkers stop returning my calls. My bosses say I'm undermining the company's reputation. And the kids? Have you given any thought to how this will affect them? Robert stepped closer, looking her straight in the eye. Are you talking about the children? He said slowly. Were you even thinking about them when you went to that room? When you were walking around with that Harris, knowing that someone might see you? Did you think about them then? Caroline turned away, her shoulders shaking. She was silent for a moment, but then turned back to him. Yes, I made a mistake. But you turned it into a public farce, destroying not only my reputation, but my future. You do not even want to realize that this was not a trivial affair, but a moment when I was able to touch lives on a whole other level. Evan Harris is not just anyone. It is a name everyone knows. It was a chance at something I could never have experienced otherwise. Yes, it was a mistake, but you made it into a weapon to destroy me completely. Robert exhaled, trying to contain himself. This is not an act, Caroline. This is the harsh consequences of your actions. You made a choice to destroy our family, and I made mine to protect what was left. Those words seemed to be the last straw. Caroline snapped. She swung her arms as if she wanted to throw something, but there was nothing at hand. You think you read better than this? She shouted, her voice shaking with hysteria. You read just a pathetic, vindictive man who not get over the fact that his wife wanted something more. You ruined my life, made me a laughingstock. I hate you. She grabbed her bag off the couch, headed quickly for the door, and turned around for a moment before tossing it over her shoulder. I hope you re-happy. I hope you re-happy in this miserable loneliness of yours. With these words, she abruptly swung the door open and ran out, slamming it loudly. Robert stood motionless, feeling the silence fill the house again. There was a quiet rustle on the stairs. The children who had been hiding upstairs peeked out cautiously, but when they saw their father's face, they immediately hid back in their room and closed the door. A few hours later, Robert was already listening intently to the voice of his attorney, Andrew Rivers, sitting in the law firm's spacious office. The glass walls overlooked the busy city streets, but Robert's gaze was focused on the folder in front of him. It was not just a legal document, it was a plan that could ruin Evan Harris's life the same way it had ruined his marriage. We re-suing under the alienation of affection clause, Andrew said, raising his eyes to Robert. It's an old law that's still on the books in our state. It's rarely enforced, but your case is perfect. We have video, photos, even public confessions on social media. We can prove that his actions directly led to the collapse of your marriage. Robert nodded, his face remaining impenetrable. What about the odds of winning? He asked. His voice was even, but there was a restrained fury in it. Very high, Andrew assured him. Harris is a public figure, and his lawyers will try to keep the case quiet to avoid further publicity. But we have too much evidence. We'll be seeking substantial compensation. It would be painful for him, financially and reputationally. Robert exhaled slowly, gathering his thoughts. He knew that this move was not only an act of revenge, but a necessity. He needed to show that consequences for betrayal were inevitable. The trial began 2 months after the lawsuit was filed. At the courthouse gathered journalists, photographers, and even ordinary gawkers, eager to see how the famous footballer will be brought to justice. Robert stood at the entrance together with Andrew, trying not to pay attention to the flashes of cameras. At the first hearing, Evan Harris' attorneys tried to argue against the suit, saying the charges were unfounded. But the judge, a woman with a cold and penetrating gaze, quickly quashed their attempts. The plaintiff's side has enough evidence for a full trial, she said, looking directly at Evan. The hearing is now in session. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. Robert watched as Evan sat at his desk, occasionally talking to his lawyers. He looked calm, but Robert could see him clenching his pen to the point of white knuckles. The testimony was undeniable. Brooke, Robert's niece, was called to the stand first. Her testimony about how she helped gather evidence impressed the judge. Then came video evidence from the hotel room, social media postings, and correspondence that was recovered with the help of experts. Mr. Harris, are you arguing that your actions had no effect on the destruction of Robert Walker's marriage? Asked the plaintiff's attorney, slowly walking in front of the podium. That's right, Evan replied, trying to sound confident. My affair with Caroline was fleeting. It was personal, and I do not think it was the reason their marriage collapsed. Andrew Rivers rose from his seat, holding printouts of social media posts. He showed them to the court. So you call this fleeting? He asked, pointing to a screen showing the scandalous posts. These publications, in which Caroline brags about your affair and calls it the chance of a lifetime, do you also consider it fleeting? Evan fell silent, not knowing how to answer. The judge looked at him with a slight shadow of judgment in her eyes. Over the next few days, the trial continued, revealing more and more details. At one point, Caroline was called as a witness. She tried to justify herself, but her words sounded weak. Her gaze avoided Robert's eyes as she described her version of events. I did not think it would go this far, she said, barely holding back tears. I made a mistake, but... Andrew interrupted her. Mrs. Walker, are you saying you did not think of the consequences? However, judging by your correspondence and actions, you were very conscious of what you were doing. Is that true? Caroline froze, not knowing what to say. There was a heavy silence in the room. The final session came to a climax. The judge announced that Evan Harris had been found guilty of destroying Robert Walker's marriage and would pay $15 million in damages. This became a record amount for such lawsuits. Evan's financial situation was shaken and his reputation was damaged. Sponsors began canceling contracts, and sports publications wrote about him with apparent disdain. For Caroline, the consequences were no less devastating. Her friends and co-workers turned their backs on her, and her family avoided socializing as well. She lost her job because her superiors deemed her behavior incompatible with corporate ethics. Robert, standing on the courthouse steps after the verdict was announced, looked out at the crowd of reporters. He knew he still had a long road ahead of him, but today was an important victory for him. It had been 2 years since Caroline had walked out of the house, slamming the door. Robert still sometimes remembered that night, but not with bitterness, but as a concussion that had caused him to wake up. Those 2 years had changed many things. His children were grown, he had rebuilt his life, and he had unexpectedly met Lauren, a woman who had become part of his new world. Their first meeting was almost accidental. Lauren brought her daughter Emily to soccer practice, where Sophia was playing. Robert, always supportive of his daughter, often attended the games and watched her grow stronger and more confident. One day after the match, Sophia and Emily, both excited, suggested that they all have dinner together. Mommy, may I? Emily asked, grabbing Lauren's hand. Sure, if Mr. Walker does not mind, Lauren replied with a warm smile. Robert, he said, extending his hand. I'm usually called Mr. Walker at work. They laughed, and that evening their family sat at the same table, discussing sports, school, and other trivia. Robert felt a lightness come into his life that he had not felt in a long time. Lauren turned out to be a woman of strong character. She was raising Emily alone after a difficult divorce from her husband, who had left her with financial problems and a lot of unresolved issues. But Lauren did not complain. She went forward, smiling and supporting her daughter in everything. Robert slowly began to notice Lauren coming into his life. She always found the right words when he doubted himself and offered simple but wise solutions where he saw only problems. One evening, after a long conversation about life, they found themselves sitting side by side on the porch of his house. The children were already asleep, and the stars shone brightly above their heads. I thought I'd never be able to trust a man again after my divorce, Lauren said, wrapping her arms around the mug of tea. But you're different. You're not afraid to talk about your feelings, not afraid to be vulnerable. It makes me believe that I can start over, too. Robert looked at her, and in that moment, everything inside him seemed to fall into place. He felt like he could trust her, and he made up his mind. I do not know what's going to happen next, he admitted, but I do know that I want you to be a part of my life. You help me believe in the best. Lauren smiled, and their conversation stretched late into the night. Their relationship developed gradually. Lauren not only became a support for Robert, but also found common ground with Sophia and James. The children adored her, especially James, who saw her as a wise mentor. Sophia and Emily became inseparable friends, and Robert's house was increasingly filled with laughter and joy. Robert and Lauren began to make plans together. They decided to merge their families, and 3 years after they first met, Lauren and Emily moved into Robert's house. It was not just a move, but a symbol of a new chapter full of trust, love, and mutual support. One day, after a couple more years, there was a knock on the door. Robert opened it and saw Caroline in front of him. Her face was serious, but her eyes were a strange mixture of guilt and determination. "We need to talk," she said. Robert nodded and invited her in. Lauren was in the garden, tending to the flowers, and the children were playing soccer in the backyard. They sat down in the living room, where scenes from their past had once played out. "I've been thinking about this for a long time," Caroline began. "I need to apologize. For everything. I ruined what we had and blamed you for my mistakes. It was not fair. You deserve better than that." Robert remained silent, watching her. Her words sounded sincere, and he could see how hard it was for her. "I accepted that a long time ago, Caroline," he replied. "But thank you for telling me. It is important for both of us. For the children." Caroline sighed, her shoulders relaxing as if a huge weight had fallen from them. Lauren entered the room at that moment, her hands stained with earth. "I'm sorry, I did not mean to interrupt," she said, smiling slightly embarrassed. "It is okay," Robert said, standing up. Caroline was just leaving. "We fine." Caroline looked at Lauren and nodded, as if recognizing that Robert had finally found what she could not give him. "Take care of them," she said before walking out the door. Robert watched her go, feeling strangely relieved. He no longer held a grudge. The past was behind him, and in front of him was the new life he was building with Lauren. Now he could focus on what really mattered: his family, his happiness, and his future. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, do not forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.